Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody here in the room together. Welcome everyone who is joining us online for this event. It's glad to be, well, I'm very glad actually, and we as CPB are very glad that actually we are able to organize an event like this again after the corona restrictions. So happy you're here, and actually we're going to involve you as well in this afternoon. Because this year's lecture is part of a longer lecture series. As you might know, we have a tradition of CPB lectures. This is the 11th CPB lecture. Last year we had Guido Imbens, who lectured us actually about the frontiers of econometric research. Afterwards he won the Nobel Prize. But he also taught us that correlation and causation are different things. But this year the lecture is going to be a little bit different because this time we want to have a conversation. And this afternoon is really not so much about people lecturing you, but actually starting a conversation, starting a thinking process about a topic which is not discussed that often. And then in the Netherlands we think there is a opportunity to do that. The conversation is really about the role of economic policy advisors. And in a recent book, Diane Coyle, who's our special guest today, she actually wrote that economists actually can do a better job than they do at this very moment. Economists, she claims, are not technicians or plumbers. It's not like the policymaker is giving you the aim and that the economic policy advisors actually just tells you exactly how to reach that particular aim. We economists like to think of ourselves as being positive rather than normative, right? But she claims actually that there's a lot of normativity in economic policy advising. And she claims that we, as an economist, should be aware of that, and that actually we can do a better job, not only for ourselves, but also for society, if we engage in a discussion about these so-called hidden norms in economic policy advising. Now, the CPB being a prime economic policy advisor here in the Netherlands, this seems to be a topic we want to discuss amongst ourselves and especially also with the outside world. So we are very glad actually that Diane is with us today to start this conversation, and we're curious to hear what she has to say about that. But as said, it's a conversation with you. So actually we also need someone to moderate that conversation. So I'm happy that Esther van Rijswijk is with us here today to moderate the afternoon, and she will tell us exactly how that's going to work. Esther?
Thank you so much, Marcel. Yeah, a conversation. So we're going to work hard, reflect upon ourselves. I say ourselves. I'm trained as an economist. I worked for a while at the Ministry of Finance, but then I kind of left actively being an economist. So I'm not sure if I can say we, but you will hear me saying we a lot of the time. I think most of you are an economist. I'm going to ask you that later today, once we've listened to Diane, because that's what we're going to do. There's also people watching from home. Welcome to you as well. And you guys here in the room can also, we will ask you to ask questions and actually answer them as well. But first, of course, our main guest for today. She's an economist that worked for the UK government, for the Treasury. She's now Professor of Public Policy at the Bennett Institute at the University of Cambridge. She researches topics like the progress and productivity, how to measure the modern economy, because things are changing, so maybe we should measure differently as well. And she does a lot of research on competition policy and new technology. She wrote this book, which is actually maybe the acute reason we are here. It's called Cogs and Monsters, What Economics Is and What It Should Be. And that is exactly what we will be discussing today. Can I have a big round of applause, please, for Diane Coyle. Diane.
Well, thank you, Marcel and Esther. Hello, everybody, and hello, everybody watching online as well. I'm not an academic in the ivory tower lecturing you about how to do your job without knowing anything about it, because as well as starting my career in the Treasury in the UK, I've held a number of economist roles in public service. I spent 8 years on the Competition Commission, on some years in the Migration Advisory Committee, Natural Capital Committee. So I have a lot of insight into the kinds of work that economists do in the government service. So please take what I say in that spirit. I'm not at all criticising my own profession. On the contrary, I think economics is fantastic, and I'm a great advocate for it. I try to communicate it. I run a festival of economics each year to try to excite young people about it. The motivation for writing my book, though, was that there are lots of criticisms of economics, and some of them are really tiresome, aren't they? People who say, oh, economists just assume that everybody's rational. We know that's not true, so everything they say is rubbish, as if behavioral economics had never happened. Or they say, but economists use these abstract models and it's all mathematics, and what nonsense is that? As if historians don't use models. The causes of the Second World War is a model. Everybody's trying to make sense of a complex world. So the book is about 3 critiques of economics that I think are fair critiques and that the profession needs to respond to. One of them is about the lack of diversity in the profession. It's in Anglo-Saxon economics, at any rate, largely male, affluent, white, and you can't be a good social science if you're so unrepresentative of the society that you're studying. You don't know what questions to ask. One of the critiques is about the way we think about the default model when we're analysing any economic context. The default being the market is largely the best way to organise the economy. There are specific market failures, and that's where we focus our policy interventions. And we come at issues from that direction. But actually, in the modern economy, in the digital economy, increasing returns to scale, externalities, network effects are so pervasive that we need to flip that around and start with a different kind of economic model, and importantly, teach a different kind of economic model as well. But the one I'm going to focus on today is the claim to objectivity. There's a long tradition of the idea of impartiality in public service. It dates back centuries and certainly includes Adam Smith with his notion of the impartial spectator. And of course, anybody doing the kinds of jobs that people in CPB are doing needs to try to adhere to that standard, to be impartial. But my argument is that economics has gone much further and really believes that it's possible to be objective about the policy context in particular that we are trying to analyse. And I think this dates back to the 1930s and positivism, which had such a big influence on people like Lionel Robbins and John Maynard Keynes. And the idea in positivism was that you could distinguish ends and means completely, that the only things that were knowable were either matters of logic or empirical fact. And anything else about values or speculation was not part of the subject of science. And that laid the foundations for the subsequent tradition in economics of thinking that we can separate the positive and the normative. So Keynes famously compared economists to dentists. Milton Friedman has a famous essay about the positive and normative in economics. We do the positive, politicians do the normative. Greg Mankiw, whose textbook has educated tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands even of economic students who end up in all kinds of jobs, used the metaphor of the engineer. And Esther Duflo recently in one of her lectures talked about economists as plumbers. And so this metaphor is really standard. And it's, we're fixing things, we analyse a situation, we get the evidence we need, there is a solution, and we know how to fix it. And so that's the model. And it's incredibly deep-seated. I think many people in this room, many audiences I've spoken to insist that that is just how things are. We're like a science in that respect. But I think it's wrong. And I think we mislead ourselves by using the term efficiency. This is the efficient outcome. We will do this analysis of consumer welfare and think about the efficiency of the policy solution or the way that the market has evolved. And yet the efficiency that we think about in economics is not at all an engineer's concept of efficiency. It's a normative concept. It's Pareto efficiency, the idea that you can't make somebody better off without making somebody else worse off. This sounds like common sense. You know, if you can say that, if you can say about some kind of intervention, it will make somebody better off without making anybody else worse off, that's terrific. And we can all be in favour of any policy that does that. There are no policies that do that, though. There are always winners and losers. There's always conflict. It's the nature of modern democracy, or even non-democracies. So this Pareto concept is normative at its heart, and yet we call it efficiency. And even if we keep it clear in our own heads, when we're talking to normal people about efficiency, they interpret it in the engineering sense. And I think that's very misleading. So, for one thing, that rules out talking about distribution. You know, we, in theory at least, rule out for ourselves any comment about policies having an impact on the distribution of incomes or consumer surplus. And of course, there are economists who directly study distributional questions. If you're studying tax policy or benefit policy, you're going to look at that. But very often, it just doesn't come into the way we think about things. There are whole domains of policy where distribution hasn't featured. And one example I would give comes from the Brexit referendum campaign in the UK. And one of my colleagues who runs a think tank called UK in a Changing Europe did a roadshow around the country talking to people about why economists said it was going to be a bad thing to leave the European Union. And the polling showed that 93% of the profession agreed with his statement. And he was expressing this in terms of GDP. And a woman in the audience said, well, that's your GDP, it's not my GDP. And until that point, the idea about the inequalities of GDP growth in the United Kingdom hadn't really featured in public debate, because GDP growth is a good thing, right? But actually, it's got embedded in it deep normative constructs. And we use market prices as the right way to weight together all of the activities or expenditures that go into GDP. Only recently have economists started to construct distributionally different, distributionally more egalitarian or democratic measures of GDP. Dale Jorgensen, who recently died sadly, has done that, and my colleague Martin Will has done that. So this is new. We certainly hadn't thought about it in 2015 and 2016, and that was a big oversight. So I want to make this claim I'm making concrete with a few more policy examples. And one of them is quantitative easing. Now, I dip into this territory with great hesitation because I'm not a macroeconomist or a monetary economist. But for many years after the financial crisis, central banks, the Bank of England in particular, would not acknowledge the fact that quantitative easing was having distributional impacts. When eventually they had to accept that the liquidity and the gains in asset markets were making some rich people very rich indeed, the argument they responded with was, if we hadn't done quantitative easing, there would have been a recession, and so people on low incomes would have been worse off now, are better off now than they would have been in that counterfactual. This is not an argument that is very easy to convey to the general public, and it's also very defensive, because actually they should have acknowledged that what they were doing was having an effect, both on the distribution of individual incomes, but also on the position of the financial sector in the economy and all of the embedded power of the financial sector. And now we're in a situation with monetary policy where, just as when I was a student in the 1970s, we have these battles, these purely ideological battles between people who believe in MMT and people who take a much more conventional approach to monetary policy. And if you have that kind of clash, you are not in positive territory, you're in normative territory. My second example is what I know more about, and that's cost-benefit analysis. Something that's bread and butter in the public service, and it's always been known that it's an inappropriate tool for big investments. It uses a linearization of an expression, and it's suitable for use for marginal changes. But it's used all the time to assess big projects and whether or not they should go ahead. Now, of course, big infrastructure projects always have a political dimension to them as well. But the way that they have been invested, again in the UK, has been very uneven geographically, and that's because of the way that the cost-benefit analysis has been done. The value of people's time and time saving in a transport project uses a national average wage, but all the other prices that go into those assessments, those projections to calculate the benefit-cost ratio, are local. And there's a Matthew effect there. Those who have shall get more, and that the benefit-cost ratio tends to look higher in places where there's already a high land value, high productivity. What's more, apart from that sort of inbuilt bias in what purports to be a very technocratic exercise, the failure to acknowledge the non-linearities that occur with big projects, I think means that we are now in a situation in the UK where we have this very fraught discussion about London and the South East versus the rest as it's framed. Because if you're in a non-linear world and you're thinking about making a big intervention, there are multiple equilibria, many possible outcomes, and they will be often be self-fulfilling. And so you could think about policy in that context as we could invest in a big infrastructure project, High Speed 2, the train line. The benefit-cost ratio looks okay, and of course they tend to reduce over time when the costs are reassessed. Let's make sure we make that a success, though. Let's think about what other investments are we going to build alongside the rail line? Where are we going to put the new housing? Where are we going to make sure that the bus routes join up with the stations? Should we think about locating a new science park or part of the Treasury in a place that's got one of these stations? So how can we think about the endogenous spatial geography of the country? And that means thinking about cost-benefit in a very non-technocratic way. It isn't a mechanical exercise of plugging numbers into forecasts. And of course, there's a huge machinery to do it. You can look on the Department of Transport website and play with that yourself. But that's not the way it's been thought of. And one of the members of the National Infrastructure Commission once said to me, if the Treasury had been doing cost-benefit analysis at the time of the Victorians, the whole country would be covered in concrete boxes, and what we have instead is infrastructure that we're still using 100, 150 years later. I mean, literally so. The first expansion of the London sewage system since 1859 is happening now, and so they had built capacity to last us for 150 years. That's not how we think about cost-benefit analysis, but perhaps we should. And this goes back to a debate in development economics, actually, in the 1960s and 70s, when Albert Hirschman made the case for thinking about these kinds of big interventions in a much more joined up, and if you like, a much more normative or political way. My final example is competition policy, which seems like the most technocratic area of economic policy. Very evidence-based assessment of competitive dynamics in a market, and there are all the techniques like snip tests and thinking about the chains of substitution and so on. But again, there are value judgments embedded here, and some of these have emerged from outside of the competition economics. So, for example, there's a new interest in the nationality of acquiring companies, and all of a sudden we're thinking, well, perhaps security may be more important than economic efficiency in some of these contexts. But also, digital markets are causing a reappraisal because markets tip. Digital markets have a winner-take-all. And so rather than thinking about the standard competition analysis between entrants at any particular time, you're thinking about Schumpeterian competition. Who can be the next winner in this market? So any decision by a competition authority to approve a merger or not, either way, is going to determine the identity of who is the dominant company in those markets. Do we care about its nationality or any of its other characteristics? Do we care if it's in a high-tech domain where we might want some locally based capacity? And the example I tend to give is what was called Project Kangaroo in the UK, a bid by the public service broadcasters' commercial arms, the BBC's commercial arm and the other commercial PSBs, to create a long-form video platform. Back in 2009, it wasn't very common, and the Competition Commission stopped it from happening. They said it would foreclose a nascent market, and they also banned the PSBs from trying anything similar for 5 years. For me, they completely misunderstood the incentives in these two-sided markets, which are to have as much content as you can because you've got to build up both sides of the market. You need the content to get the viewers, and you need the viewers to get the content. But that 5-year ban meant that Netflix is now the biggest broadcaster in the UK. I don't know whether or not we care about that, but that was a consequence of that decision, and it's not a purely technical decision. So in competition economics as well, we now have political battles re-emerging. The Brandeisi and structuralists in the United States, with their concern about SMEs and workers, did the consumer welfare lens that traditional competition assessments bring ignore the detriments that were happening on the supply side of the market? So we're again here in a world of competing theories about how competition analysis should be done. So I'm not arguing at all that policy economists should make value judgments that are rightly those of politicians, nor am I saying that we all ought to go around with a badge saying which party we support, far from it. We need to stick to that idea of the impartial spectator in making the assessments. But I think we do have to acknowledge these issues, because if what we're trying to do is say that we assess things in order that decision makers can make things better, we have to talk about what it means to make things better, and that's inherently a normative concept. And a final comment, I think that's really important for the legitimacy of what we do. Economists in the UK were very bruised by the Brexit experience because we had done our usual kind of analysis. The evidence was really strong that there was going to be a hit to GDP growth. And you'll be aware about all the commentary, including from prominent government ministers, about we've had enough of experts. And I think we're in that environment, an anti-expert environment. We shouldn't be pandering to it, but I think we do have to start to acknowledge these issues and talk about the normative dimensions of the work that we do. So I'm going to stop there. Over to you, Esther.
If you, you're going to stop there, but continue here,
okay,
please. Thank you so much for that. Before we go on, maybe we would like to know a bit more about the audience. Who are they? So I'm going to ask you also to get the thinking. We need to move a bit. Move helps the brain. I see some people like this. It's sole sombre, isn't it? The sun is changing, so it will be better for you. Let me see. First,
it's been quite nice, Esther, to have the spotlight on the audience and see the reactions.
It's different, isn't it?
Yeah,
it really feels like you can talk to them now. So we will. Let me first ask you, what are you actually? So please stand up if you are an economist or a mathematician. Please stand up. Wow. Yeah, define economist. Well, you can decide for yourself. Do you feel like you're an economist? Okay, now sit back, please. That seems like everybody, but is there maybe somebody in the room who was not standing up? If you can stand up, please. And so what are you?
I'm a sociologist by training, but I'm a methodologist at the Social and Cultural.
Okay, a sociologist by training and now working for the Social and Cultural Bureau, Planning Bureau. We have all these planning bureaus, but forget the planning part. And would you say that is at least as important as being an economist, isn't it? Yes, I think so.
That was an easy question.
Yeah, so we're happy to have her in the room, don't we? Is there anybody else? So there's two standing. What do you do, sir? Okay, political scientist and the environmental, the PBL. Yeah, PBL. So there's an environmental assessment agency as well. Happy to have you in the room. Who's here? Philosopher. A philosopher. Oh. We always need philosophers, don't we? Where do you work?
I have a PhD in philosophy of economics.
So you're working at the university. Happy to have you too. And then, well, also I want to have an idea, but maybe to know who of you is working inside the government and who is like an analyzer for an independent body like the CPB. So stand up people working inside the government at the ministry. Ah, there's the ministry people. Yes. Paul, are you working at the ministry? Yeah, but that's kind of independent, isn't it? So you can sit down. What ministry? Of the Interior, and behind you, the sir? Finance. Okay, so we have a lot of policy advisors, I guess, then. Something else? So I assume most of you are policy analyzers, I'm sorry, so outside a ministry. Anything else? No? Okay. We also were wondering what age or experience we have. I think we have a rather young audience. Who of you has been working for more than 20 years doing this, what you're doing, or working in the fields of economics? Please stand up. So the old guys and girls, stand up. Okay, I would say that's about 40%. So we have that's a good combination to have, isn't it? Do you expect that there's a difference between the generations in how they think about this?
The thing you observe most of all with students is how much more concerned they are with environmental issues, issues of inequality and poverty. So absolutely different generation in terms of those kinds of interests.
Yeah, and do they have I mean, they have their worries, and you are happy that they have these kind of worries, but do they also kind of follow you in your way of thinking when it comes to the acknowledgement of the values or positivity against?
Well, they do by the time I finish with them. But
Okay.
I've been for many years working on an alternative economics curriculum called the Core Economy, which is a free online curriculum, which tries to take a very different perspective from the standard economic textbooks, which is being adopted by many universities now.
Okay, so I was trained, I hardly dare say, 30 years ago, something like that. What is completely different? What are you doing with them? What I have never heard of?
We called it the economy and not economics, and it starts with the problems, and it addresses political economy issues such as imbalances of power in the labour market.
Yep.
It talks about innovation and environmental change, so it brings in these different kinds of modelling approaches.
Yep.
It doesn't focus it on identifying market failures. There's no presumption that markets are for the best.
Okay, that's
So
a very important one, I can imagine. Yeah. Let's see. I would like to see, do you agree that economists, I mean, it's a very big group, should kind of change their way of researching or working or advising? We can do this with using your hand. So who says yes, we should change in general? We should change.
Gosh.
Is that the older guys keeping their hands down, or is it not that simple? What do you see?
I think it's more mixed than that.
It's more mixed than that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, if you can all stand up again, this is the last time, I promise you. Please all stand up, all rise. So my question is, are you doing this already? Are you changing already? So maybe some of the people who just stayed seated didn't raise their hands because they thought, well, I'm already doing it. So if you say, well, I'm not doing it, or maybe a bit, so on a scale of 0 to 10, 2 to 5, you can now sit down. So the people that are still standing are at least saying, I'm doing it quite a bit. So these of you, if you agree, I'm doing quite a bit. So that's 6 and 7, go down. Now the ones left standing are saying, I'm doing it a lot. So we have here in the front, the director of the CPB. We have one of our panelists in a bit. Somebody dies before we mention your name. What's your name, sir? And you work where?
I'm retired.
You're retired.
I can remember, I worked once at the CPB and I invited sociologists and historians.
Okay.
Shock.
So not only, I will say it again because otherwise people at home won't have heard it. So this is Mr. Van Paridon. He worked at the CPB. He's not working now anymore, but he already long time ago invited sociologists and other disciplines into the CPB. Last man standing. What's your name? Kees Coles, yeah.
Economist and philosopher, and I'm now
Okay, this gentleman, for the people at home, his work is Kees Cole or Coles? Coles, yes, I'm sorry. And he's working on a big initiative to stop shareholder capitalism. I think we can make a whole seminar on that alone. I'm going to stop you there for a moment. I'll be back with you because I don't have a mic with me, but I will be more in the audience later, so grab your chance then. Are a lot of people saying we're doing it already? And then what do you think most of the time when they say so?
I've had quite a mixed reaction. Academic economists tend to say, oh, this digital stuff, so-and-so is doing really good work on this, which is of course true. There is some excellent work going on. What I'm talking about is changing the mindset from which you start and spreading that beyond the academic world into the policy world and public understanding. Among a policy audience, mostly people say that's very interesting, I hadn't really thought about that, particularly on competition policy, where there is emerging a very lively debate now for obvious reasons about digital. But some people get very defensive about it. And they either say, no, Diane, you're talking nonsense, or no, we're doing all of that already. We don't need to change anything.
Okay. I think that normally on events like this, the people that come, they like to listen to you. So I think a lot of them agree or are at least
sample
open
selection
to
bias.
it. Yes, there is a selection bias, yeah. Another question. So policy economists are always lagging behind the academic frontier, of course. You claim that in the book as well, and it's logical because they were educated a long time ago. But this has always been the case. Is the problem getting bigger? Is the gap getting bigger between what people, how they are using whatever they have learned and not keeping up with what's happening?
That's a very interesting question, and I think it's because the context is changing. And it's partly, in many countries, we're observing quite polarized politics and voting upsets, and people, different groups in society have particular grievances that need thinking about. So the vote leavers in my example. So partly that, but partly also the way that digital has transformed the economy. And my core research is about how do we think about and measure what's happening with the digital economy. We use these devices a day a week, 28 hours a week is the latest figure on average for being online in the UK. It's transformed business models. It's really hard to see it in the economic statistics, but also in lots of economic analysis. And yet, computer scientists, people in machine learning, think about ethics all the time, and there are lots of ethicists looking at AI for the reason that machine learning systems are homo economicus, but more efficient in the engineering sense. They are given an objective function, they're told to optimize for that objective function, and they're going to do that superbly well. So you really need to think hard about what you're coding into those objective functions. And a lot of politics, a lot of policy is about compromise. You can't code compromise. And so why is it that people in AI are thinking a lot about ethics when they're talking about the kinds of models that we do? They use a lot of social choice theory, and we're not talking about that.
Yeah, okay, so the world is changing, it's digitalization, it's artificial intelligence, and it's changing faster than ever. Is that also part of the equation? Because the world has always been changing.
I think it is a moment of the adoption of technology having speeded up, although everybody always thinks things are changing too quickly, especially at my age.
Yeah, it's okay. You point out, and you mentioned it just in your speech, that that people distrust experts more and more. And you seem to say that economists, by being the experts they are feeding populism. Did I hear that correct? Or is that too blunt a translation?
It's a little bit too blunt, but I think there's a question about the legitimacy of claiming expertise without acknowledging people's concerns about it. To go back to my Brexit example again, and you can tell how deep the scars run, one of the responses of the Royal Economic Society and other societies was to say, we need to improve our public communications, and they have put a lot of effort into doing so. But they need to communicate with the ears as well as with the voice. You just need to listen to people's concerns. And it's that two-way conversation that I think is really necessary now, because we do risk our legitimacy in our expertise, which is real if we don't pay attention to it.
So when it comes to the populism problem and experts not being trusted anymore, it's maybe even more about getting into communication with them and listening than about feeding your values into a system without being clear about it. Okay.
Yes.
Good.
Because we're very powerful.
We are. Or you are, I'm not. I'm going to ask you, I'm going to see if there's one or two questions. For now, it's the clarifying questions that I would like to hear. So is there something about what Diane was just talking about that you don't really understand? So it's going to be hard. Don't go into a debate. I like to say don't go into a debate yet, but maybe not. Let's not go into a debate for the whole afternoon. Let's try to listen and understand and think about how can we improve what we do or can be better economists. So is there anybody who says, there's something I don't get. I need a clarification on that. Somebody here and the Mr. Case calls again. I'll be with you in a second. If you stand up, please.
Thank you.
And what's your name?
My
Let's
name is Hans Schenk.
go a little bit there, then the people at home can see us as well.
There?
No. We're turning a bit towards the camera.
Yes, and my name is Hans Schenk, and I was wondering when you were asking whether people from the business community also would stand up, but you didn't. So I'm a business economist and working for a number of multi-billion companies, especially involved with M&A. Now, I was an academic before, also involved with M&A, and I heard you say something about the rise of Brandeisian competition analysis. I wonder whether that fits in with the dominant mainstream approach to economics, which is neoclassical, at all. Or should we do away with neoclassical's insights in order to get into this Brandeisian stream?
Can you elaborate a little bit on that Brandeisian stream? Because I don't know what we're talking about.
So it's also called hipster economics by people who don't approve of it. And Lena Khan, who's chair of the FTC, is the prominent member of this school, I suppose. And the argument goes back to the structural debates about monopoly power in the United States in the 1920s and 30s, when the argument was made by Brandeisians was, this company is just too big and powerful. You don't need to bother with consumer welfare analysis. Think about the power structures, just break them up, and the trust busting emerged after that. There's always been in neoclassical industrial organization theory a bit of a strand of thinking about structure, but in competition policy, it's been swept aside by neoclassical models where the focus is on consumer welfare, and in the US in particular, that got interpreted as just thinking about the prices that consumers paid. And so as long as prices were low, you didn't care about the size of the companies, and we have these big tech companies who charge a zero price. So isn't that marvelous? And the neo-Brandeisian claim is actually that's not marvelous. Here's concentrations of power. Let's break up these concentrations of power. The question, is neoclassical economics wrong, I think goes beyond a factual clarification. So maybe we'll come back to that debate later.
Okay.
But nice try.
Nice try.